I've long been a fan of the Roubo style workbench, and recently I decided to undertake the task of making one. I was inspired by a video that I saw from David Barron of David Barron Furniture in the UK, and it inspired me to build this Roubo workbench. This is a SketchUp animation. The thing that's most interesting about this workbench is the way that the legs join with the tabletop. It truly is a nice piece of engineering, and it's very pleasing to the eye. The bench itself is about 2 to 2.5 feet wide by 6 feet long. You can adjust those dimensions as you like, but you just need to make sure that the tabletop is exactly 3 inches thick and that each one of the components that meet with the leg assembly are exactly 1 inch wide. That's to ensure that all of the dimensions for the leg assembly work out properly, and we'll go through all of those dimensions to make it a little bit easier for you. I had to go through trial and error on this, but this process that I've got here works out pretty well. This is the leg assembly by itself. There are 3 components to it, and it's laminated. So it's laminated from 2x6 lumber that has been milled to 5 inches wide by exactly 1 inch thick again. And there are 3 components: a dovetail component, a support component, and a wedge component. Here's a look at the dovetail component. There are 3 parts to the tabletop assembly that join to the leg components. And as you can see, that the leg component looks a lot like a dovetail joint, so that's the reason that I refer to it as a dovetail component, for no other reason than that. And the angle on it, nothing overly complicated about that. It's a 45-degree angle. This is the support piece. These are the easiest cuts on the entire bench, quite frankly, so not much to look at here. Here's the wedge assembly, and this is the more complicated part of the construction of the workbench. But the angled cuts, don't become overly concerned with them. If you stick to the dimensions, the angles will work themselves out, and it doesn't have to be as precise as a dovetail because you won't be able to see it. Here's a close-up of what the wedge component looks like. A 3/4 inch shoulder offset with 1/8 of an inch further in down on the bottom from the shoulder. And then it's, I believe, about 1 inch from the top. Again, we'll look at the dimensions in a few moments, but then into each one of those thin slits, that's where the wedge gets tapped in so that the wedge will have the decorative look that it does. We want to make absolutely sure that our wedge component and our dovetail component for each of the 4 legs, when we assemble the tabletop, that they sit 3/8 of an inch proud, at least 3/8 of an inch proud of the tabletop, and that will give us the additional room that we need in order to be able to flush trim that and then use our planes in order to be able to plane everything smooth. So let's take a look at the legs in a little bit more detail. The legs are constructed out of dimensional lumber, 2x6s to be exact. Each component has been dimensioned to be 1 inch thick by 5 inches wide and 36 3/8 inches tall. The pieces are laminated together to make a single solid leg, which functions very well for this workbench. So let's take a look at the pieces individually. Here's the dovetail component. As you can see, 2 feet 9 inches from the bottom of the leg is where the shoulder takes place. And then 3 3/8 inches above that is the dovetail component itself. Looking more closely at the dimensions of the specific dovetail component, when we come up to 2 feet 9 inches, we want to make a mark 1 inch in and then create a 45-degree cut from the corner of the leg to that 1 inch shoulder inset. That will give us our dovetail. The support piece, like I said earlier, this is one of the easiest boards to create in the entire project. So take your 2x6, dimension it to 1x5, and then cut it off at 2 feet 9 inches, and that's all there is to it. The wedge component, same thing, 2 feet 9 inches from the bottom is where we're going to make our shoulder, and then we've got 3 3/8 on the top part of the component to create the receivers for the wedges that will be tapped in a little bit later on. And looking at the wedge component itself a little more closely, we can see that the shoulders on either side of the piece are 3/4 inch shoulders. And then we come in an additional 1/8 of an inch and make a tick mark after we cut out the shoulder, so that when we go to the very top of the wedge piece, we'll come in 1 inch and then join those 2 tick marks in order to make our saw line that we will use in order to make the slits to which we will insert the wedges. Sincere thanks to David Barron for the inspiration on this wedge component to the leg assembly. It really is quite clever. So very quickly, let's take a look at the mortise components. There are 3, well actually 2, and then there's just the one support piece in the middle, the 6-foot piece. But let's take a look at how the leg assemblies marry up to the table, and that is through these mortises. The dovetail component is made of 2 mirror-imaged smaller pieces and then 1 central piece. All of these components are cut precisely from a 1x3 piece of lumber. The central piece is 4 feet 8 inches long, and then you want to make a 45-degree angle cut such that the top piece winds up being 4 feet 6 inches long. The wing components cut from a 5-inch long piece of stock and then a 45-degree bevel cut, which leaves the centralmost part of that piece at 4 inches. The support stock, again, 1x3 component that is 6 feet long. And when we're talking about thickness versus width, I'm referring to width as the 1-inch width and 3 inches thick, because the 3 inches represents the thickness of the tabletop. So if that's a little bit confusing, I apologize, but this is what I'm referring to whenever I talk about width versus thickness. Sorry for any confusion. Very quickly, taking a look at the receiver for the wedge component. The central piece, it's cut from, again, 1x3. And it is cut from a piece that is 4 feet 7.5 inches long, and then we make what amounts to be a 14-degree bevel cut, which causes the top part of the component to be 4 feet 6 inches long. The wing pieces, 4 3/4 inches at the bottom by 4 inches on the top, and that's it. So let's take a look at some real wood. Okay, get your minds out of the gutter. So here we are looking at the laminated tabletop with the legs inserted through the tabletop wedge mortise. But my eyes aren't so good. Let's zoom in a little bit so that we can see the detail. I said my eyes aren't so good, so let's zoom in enough so that we can see the detail. Okay, that's too much. There we go, that's better. So here we can clearly see the wedge component and its tabletop wedge mortise. We can also see the tabletop support component. And we can also see the dovetail leg component, which is exposed at this point. The tabletop mortise for the dovetail component is the very last piece to be added to the tabletop. That comes at the very end of the build. So after a successful dry fit, it's time for the glue up. Now this is best accomplished with the table inverted, lying on its tabletop. I've put a couple of boards under there to make the glue up easier, because remember, those leg components are 3/8 inch proud, so they won't go all the way through if the tabletop is lying flat on the ground. One of the reasons that we glue this up with the table inverted is because the legs and their mortise and tenon support pieces are much easier to deal with than trying to maneuver that tabletop. She's heavy. So after the glue up and after adding the dovetail mortise parts to the tabletop, here's what she looks like. She is pretty, isn't she? We'll talk a little bit more about what those walnut plugs are about here in just a moment, but let's get a good look at how that wedge component and dovetail component marry into that tabletop. It really does look neat. Those walnut plugs are covering up 3-inch deck screws. I don't know that it was really necessary with the glue-ups and the lamination, but I just wanted to make absolutely certain that the piece had as much structural integrity as it possibly could. And so 3-inch deck screws was the answer for me. Really do like the way that the piece came together. It looks really nice. With regard to the smoothing of the tabletop and the smoothing of the leg components, it was all done with those 3 planes, that number 7 plane doing the vast majority of the heavy blocking and tackling there. And there are the shavings on the ground to prove it. One more quick look at how the wedge component and dovetail component marry into the tabletop. It really does look nice. If I had it all to do over again, I would have filmed this build from front to back so that you really would have gotten a much more in-depth tour of the ins and outs of how to build one of these. I promise if I build another one, I will film it from front to back. Thanks for watching.